She arrived at the mansion just to work, never imagining that she would awaken the envy and contempt of the other employees. While being humiliated and ostracized, a millionaire silently observed her strength and dignity. Intrigued by her rare sincerity, he makes a decision that shocks everyone. But no one was prepared for the twist that would transform her life forever. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing. Sarah adjusted her simple uniform one more time before crossing the imposing gates of the Thompson estate. Her rough fingers, marked by years of hard work, nervously smoothed the fabric of her apron as she contemplated the magnitude of the building before her. The mansion, with its ivory-toned walls and tall windows reflecting the morning sun, seemed intimidating and at the same time represented a new hope in her life. At 35, Sarah carried in her brown eyes the determination of someone who had known life's difficulties early on. She had practically raised her 3 younger siblings alone after being abandoned by their parents. And now, finally, she had the chance at a job that could change her family's life. The mansion of Mr. William Thompson, one of the most discreet and influential businessmen in the city, would be her new workplace. "You must be the new maid," a cold voice greeted her in the entrance hall. It was Mrs. Harris, the housekeeper, a lady with a rigid posture and analytical gaze. Her grey hair was perfectly tied in a bun, and her impeccable uniform made clear the hierarchy established there. "Yes, ma'am. Sarah Miller," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Well, let's establish some basic rules," Mrs. Harris began, leading Sarah through the luxurious corridors. "Mr. Thompson is extremely private and demands absolute discretion from all employees. Any comment about his personal life or about what happens in this house will be grounds for immediate dismissal." As they walked, Sarah noticed the curious glances and some malicious smiles from the other employees. A young maid whispered something to another, and both laughed discreetly. The environment, despite the luxury, already seemed hostile. "Your room is in the staff wing," Mrs. Harris continued, opening the door to a simple but clean room. "You'll have Sundays off as long as it doesn't coincide with special events. Your work starts at 6 a.m. and ends when all tasks are completed." Sarah nodded, storing her small suitcase under the bed. She had only a few changes of clothes and an old photo of her siblings, her most precious possession. "I can start right now," she offered, eager to prove her worth. "Excellent. Start by cleaning the library. It's one of Mr. Thompson's favorite places, and the last employee couldn't keep up with the required standard," Mrs. Harris explained, with a smile suggesting that this would not be an easy task. In the library, Sarah found an immense room, with shelves going from floor to ceiling. Thousands of books occupied every available inch, and the accumulated dust indicated that the work would be arduous. But she wasn't intimidated. She started methodically, carefully removing each book, cleaning it individually before putting it back in its place. Hours passed without her noticing, completely absorbed in her task. It was then that she heard footsteps approaching. "So you're the new employee?" A deep and serene voice surprised her. It was Mr. Thompson, a man in his 70s, with well-trimmed white hair and perceptive blue eyes. Sarah immediately stood up, nervous. "Yes, sir. I apologize for the momentary mess. I'm organizing everything." To her surprise, Mr. Thompson smiled slightly. "Don't worry, it's the first time I've seen someone treat my books with such care. Most just dust over them." "Books are treasures, sir," Sarah responded without thinking. "Each one tells a different story, deserves respect." Mr. Thompson's gaze lit up with interest. "Do you like to read?" "Whenever I can. I taught myself reading stories to my younger siblings," she explained, then mentally reprimanding herself for sharing personal information. "Interesting," he murmured, picking up one of the books she had just cleaned. "Keep up the good work. Miss Sarah, sir, Sarah Miller." "Welcome to the mansion, Miss Sarah," he said, before leaving with the book in his hands. That brief encounter, although she didn't know it yet, would be the first of many that would completely change the course of her life. For now, Sarah returned to work, ignoring the malicious comments already circulating around the house about her conversation with the boss. She's already thinking she's special just because Mr. Thompson spoke to her. she heard a voice say from the hallway. "Must think she's better than all of us," another replied. Sarah took a deep breath and continued her task. She knew that her value wasn't in others' comments, but in the dignity with which she performed her work. The library was just the beginning of her journey in that mansion, and she was determined to face any challenge with the same strength that had brought her there. The following weeks at the Thompson mansion proved to be a real test of Sarah's resilience. Each morning brought new challenges, some natural to the work, others carefully orchestrated by those who didn't accept her presence. The staff breakfast, served in the kitchen at 5:30 a.m., became a particularly tense moment. "Oops, sorry," said Jennifer, one of the older maids, as she accidentally spilled coffee on the sleeve of Sarah's uniform. "You should be more careful where you put your arms." Sarah just smiled slightly, cleaning the stain with a napkin. "No problem. Good thing I brought another uniform." "Another one of those simple uniforms?" taunted Rachel, another employee. "You should put more effort into your appearance, especially now that you're having private conversations with the boss." The comment caused poorly disguised giggles throughout the kitchen. Sarah maintained her dignity, finishing her coffee in silence. The provocations had increased since Mr. Thompson had begun to request her presence in the library more frequently, asking for her opinion on different books or simply talking about literature. "Sarah," called Mrs. Harris, entering the kitchen, with her usual severe expression. "Mr. Thompson has requested that you organize the rare book collection today, and don't forget your other tasks." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, getting up. She knew she would have to work double to make up for the time in the library, but she didn't mind. In the library, she found Mr. Thompson already settled in his favorite armchair, an old copy of Mark Twain in his hands. "Good morning, Miss Sarah. I hope I'm not disrupting your routine." "Not at all, sir," she replied, heading to the rare bookshelves. "You know, I've been observing how you've been treated by the other employees," he commented, surprising her. "Your patience is admirable." Sarah paused her work for a moment. "You don't need to worry about that, sir. They're just small misunderstandings." "Small misunderstandings that could make many give up," he observed. "What keeps you here, Miss Sarah?" She thought for a moment before answering. "My siblings, sir. Everything I do is for them. The youngest is about to start college. He'll be the first in the family." Mr. Thompson observed her with renewed interest. "Tell me more about your family." For the next hour, Sarah shared stories about how she raised her siblings, the nights studying after work, the daily sacrifices. Mr. Thompson listened attentively, asking occasional questions that showed genuine interest. "You must think it's foolish for a domestic worker to dream of certain things," she said, embarrassed after mentioning her desire to one day be able to help other families in similar situations. "On the contrary," he replied firmly, "I find it admirable. You know, Miss Sarah, I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who only approached me out of self-interest. It's refreshing to find someone who maintains their values regardless of circumstances." The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Harris, who entered the library with a displeased expression. "Mr. Thompson, your nephews are on the phone. They say it's urgent." Mr. Thompson's countenance changed instantly. "Tell them I'm busy," he responded dryly. Turning to Sarah, he explained, "Family. Sometimes blood ties are the most fragile." That afternoon, as Sarah cleaned the second-floor corridors, she overheard a conversation she shouldn't have. Jennifer and Rachel were talking in one of the rooms, leaving the door ajar. "Did you see? Now she spends hours in the library with the old man," Jennifer said. "She must be trying to secure her place in the will." "Mrs. Harris is furious," Rachel replied. "She said Mr. Thompson's nephews are already asking about this suspicious closeness." Sarah felt her heart tighten. She had never considered how her conversations with the boss could be interpreted. More than that, the mention of a will made her realize the complexity of the situation she was getting involved in. That night in her simple room, Sarah wrote a letter to her siblings, as she did every week. She told them about the book she was getting to know, about the small joys of her work, but omitted the difficulties. She didn't want to worry them. Upon finishing the letter, she looked at the family photo on her small table and smiled. The provocations and intrigues of the mansion seemed small compared to the love she felt for them. What Sarah didn't know was that her daily trials were being observed much more closely than she imagined, and that her behavior in the face of adversity was planting seeds that would soon blossom in unexpected ways. The Thompson mansion awoke agitated that Monday. The employees were running from one side to the other, preparing everything for an event that Mr. Thompson rarely allowed, a family lunch. His nephews had insisted so much that he finally gave in, although his expression clearly showed his displeasure with the situation. "Sarah," called Mrs. Harris while supervising the preparations, "Mr. Thompson specifically requested that you be responsible for service in the dining room today." The news caused an immediate buzz among the other employees. Traditionally, family events were conducted only by the house's most senior staff. Rachel, who had always served on these occasions, couldn't disguise her indignation. "But she doesn't even have experience with formal events," she protested. "She'll embarrass us in front of the family." "These are direct orders from the boss, Mrs. Harris replied dryly, although her look showed that she shared the same opinion. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. As she meticulously arranged the dining table, making sure each piece of cutlery and glass was in its exact position, she was surprised by Mr. Thompson's presence. "I see you're putting a lot of effort into the arrangement," he commented, observing her work with approval. "I want to live up to your trust, sir," Sarah replied, adjusting a flower arrangement in the center of the table. "Miss Sarah," he began, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I need to make a special request of you. During this lunch, pay attention to the comments and behaviors of my nephews. I trust your judgment and discretion." Sarah looked at him, surprised by the unusual request. "But sir—" "Just observe," he gently interrupted her. "We'll talk later." The lunch began promptly at noon. 3 of Mr. Thompson's nephews attended: Richard, a middle-aged executive with an arrogant air; Melissa, a socialite who couldn't take her eyes off her cell phone; and Eric, the youngest, who seemed genuinely out of place in the family environment. Sarah served discreetly, while absorbing the dynamics of the meeting. The questions from the older nephews invariably revolved around their uncle's business, his properties, and mainly his health. "Uncle William, have you been consulting with that specialist I recommended?" Richard asked, with false concern in his voice. "My health is very good, thank you," Mr. Thompson answered dryly. "But it's important to take care of yourself, Uncle," Melissa insisted. "After all, you're not young anymore and need to think about the future of all of us." Sarah noticed how Mr. Thompson slightly tightened his grip on the cutlery at the comment as she poured more wine into his glass. "Speaking of the future," Richard continued, "we heard that you've been spending a lot of time in the library lately, with company." The silence that followed was cutting. Sarah, who was serving dessert, felt all eyes turn to her. "My routine and with whom I choose to spend my time are not topics for this table," Mr. Thompson replied firmly. Eric, who had remained silent, finally spoke up. "Uncle, I brought that poetry book you lent me last year." The attempt to change the subject was welcome, but the mood had already been established. The lunch ended shortly after, with tense goodbyes and forced smiles. That night, as requested, Sarah met Mr. Thompson in the library to share her observations. To her surprise, he seemed more relieved than worried. "You know, Miss Sarah, I've spent years watching my family approach me only out of self-interest," he began, sitting in his usual armchair. "Today, I finally made an important decision." "What decision, sir?" she asked, genuinely concerned about his thoughtful expression. "I can't reveal it yet, but know that your presence in this house has helped me see many things more clearly," he replied enigmatically. "Now, tell me more." "About that social project you mentioned the other day, to help needy families." The conversation flowed naturally, as it always did between them. Outside the library, however, Mrs. Harris listened to everything attentively, her expression growing increasingly worried. Immediately after moving away, she picked up the phone and made a call. "Mr. Richard, we need to talk about your uncle and about this maid. The situation is getting out of control." Meanwhile, in her room, Sarah looked out the window, reflecting on the day's events. Something was changing in the mansion. She could feel it. What she didn't know was that she was about to find herself at the center of a storm that would transform not only her life, but that of everyone around her. The days following the family lunch brought subtle but significant changes to the routine of the Thompson mansion. Mr. Thompson began to request Sarah's presence not only in the library, but also on his walks through the extensive gardens of the property. The conversations, previously centered on literature, now encompassed more personal topics and plans for the future. "Look at these rose bushes, Miss Sarah," he commented during one of their morning walks. "My late wife planted them over 4 decades ago. She always said that flowers need sincere love to truly bloom." Sarah observed the roses with admiration. "Your wife must have been a very special person, sir." "Elizabeth was unique," he replied with a nostalgic smile. "She knew how to see beauty in the simplest things like you." The comment caught Sarah by surprise, making her blush slightly. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by Mrs. Harris, who approached hurriedly. "Mr. Thompson, forgive the intrusion, but your lawyer, Mr. Carter, is on the phone. He says it's urgent." Mr. Thompson's countenance changed instantly. "I need to take this. We'll continue our conversation later, Miss Sarah." As she returned to the mansion, Sarah noticed movement in the nearby bushes. Jennifer and Rachel emerged discreetly from their hiding place, exchanging significant looks. In the kitchen, during the staff lunch, the atmosphere was even tenser than usual. Conversations ceased abruptly when Sarah entered the room, and the whispers increased when she left. "Mr. Carter never comes to the mansion this frequently," commented one of the older cooks. "Something big is happening." "And that one always nearby, it's no coincidence," added Rachel, casting a sidelong glance at Sarah. That afternoon, while organizing the curtains in the main hallway, Sarah inadvertently overheard a heated conversation coming from Mr. Thompson's office. "William, you need to reconsider." Mr. Carter's voice sounded worried. "Your nephews won't accept this peacefully." "My decision is made, Robert," Mr. Thompson replied firmly. "I've spent too much time worrying about others' expectations. Now I want to do what's right." Sarah tried to move away discreetly, but she bumped into a decorative vase, causing a small noise. The office door opened immediately, revealing Mr. Carter, who looked at her with a mixture of surprise and distrust. "I'm sorry, I was just cleaning." "The curtains," she explained, embarrassed. "Don't worry, Miss Sarah," Mr. Thompson intervened. "In fact, your presence is timely. Robert, this is the person I told you about." The lawyer examined her with a penetrating gaze, as if trying to decipher a complex puzzle. "I see. Well, in this case, we'll need to prepare additional documentation." Later, that same day, Sarah found an anonymous note in her room. "Be careful with your next steps. Not everyone is what they seem to be." Disturbed, she decided to share the occurrence with Eric, Mr. Thompson's youngest nephew, who occasionally visited the library and had always treated her with respect. "This is more serious than you imagine, Sarah," he warned after reading the note. "My siblings are furious about the influence you have over our uncle. They are capable of anything to protect what they consider their rightful inheritance." "But I've never asked your uncle for anything," Sarah protested. "Our conversations are just—" "I know," Eric gently interrupted. "And that's exactly why my uncle trusts you so much, but you need to be careful. There's more at stake than you realize." That night, while everyone slept, a secret meeting was taking place at Richard's house. Mrs. Harris, visibly nervous, reported the latest happenings at the mansion. "Mr. Carter brought new documents today," she informed, "and from what I could gather, your uncle is planning something big." "That little maid got what she wanted," Melissa snarled. "But it's not over yet. We'll show her it's not so easy to become part of the Thompson family." Richard, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke up. "I think it's time we pay our dear uncle a surprise visit, and this time we'll make our position on certain changes in his life very clear." Back at the mansion, Sarah remained awake in her room, rereading the latest letter from her siblings. The words of gratitude and love in those simple lines were her safe harbor amid the brewing storm. Unknowingly, she was about to face the most decisive moment of her life, where her choices and integrity would be tested in ways she had never imagined. The morning began differently at the Thompson mansion. Mr. William didn't come down for his usual breakfast on the veranda, and Mrs. Harris informed everyone that he wasn't feeling well. The news caused immediate agitation among the staff, especially after the hurried arrival of the family doctor. Sarah continued her routine tasks, trying to ignore the accusing looks that followed her. It was then that Mrs. Harris appeared, with a grave expression on her face. "Mr. Thompson is requesting your presence in his room," she announced, with evident displeasure. "Immediately." Upon entering the main bedroom of the mansion, Sarah found Mr. Thompson sitting in an armchair near the window. Despite the paleness in his face, his eyes maintained their characteristic gleam of determination. "Ah, Miss Sarah," he said, gesturing for her to approach. "Please sit down. We have a very important matter to discuss." Mr. Carter, who was present in the room, exchanged a significant look with Mr. Thompson before heading to the door. "I'll be in the hallway if you need me, William." When they were alone, Mr. Thompson took a deep breath before beginning. "Miss Sarah, over these months you've brought something to this house that has long been absent: sincerity. Your presence has reminded me of values that I feared were lost in our society." Sarah felt her heart race, unsure about the direction of this conversation. "So you've always been very kind to me." "No, my dear," he gently interrupted her. "You have been an example of dignity and character, and that's why I need to make a very serious proposal to you." He paused, adjusting himself in the armchair. "This small health issue I had today made me realize that I can no longer postpone certain decisions. Sarah, I would like to marry you." The shock of the proposal made Sarah stand up abruptly. "Mr. Thompson, I don't understand." "Please let me explain," he asked, raising his hand. "This is not about romance, but a calculated decision. I need someone I can trust completely to take care of not just my assets, but especially the legacy I've built. Someone who knows the true value of things and people." "But at your family," Sarah began, still bewildered. "My family has long been interested only in what they can inherit from me," he replied bitterly. "You, on the other hand, have never shown interest in my fortune. Your concerns have always been genuine, your gestures always sincere." At this moment, they heard raised voices in the hallway. The door opened abruptly, revealing Richard and Melissa, followed by a visibly embarrassed Mr. Carter. "So it's true," Melissa exclaimed, her face contorted with fury. "You've completely lost your mind, Uncle." "How dare you propose something so absurd?" Richard vociferated. This maid has obviously manipulated you." Mr. Thompson stood up, his figure imposing even in his weakened state. "How dare you invade my chambers like this? My decisions are not up for discussion." "Uncle William?" Eric intervened, who had just arrived and was trying to calm the situation. "Please think carefully." "I've thought enough," Mr. Thompson cut him off. "Mr. Carter, please prepare the documents as we discussed. And as for you," he addressed his nephews, "I suggest you respect my choices if you wish to maintain any kind of relationship with me." Sarah, who had remained silent during the confrontation, finally found her voice. "Mr. Thompson, I need time to think. It's a very serious decision." "Of course," he replied softly. "Take all the time you need." As she left the room, Sarah felt the weight of all the gazes upon her. Mrs. Harris watched her with an indescribable expression, while the other employees whispered without disguise. In her simple room that night, Sarah faced the photo of her siblings, silent tears running down her face. Mr. Thompson's proposal could change not only her life, but that of her entire family. However, the price of this change would be high, facing the distrust and contempt of everyone around her. Outside, the mansion was buzzing with the news. Secret meetings were held, phone calls exchanged, and plans elaborated. The silent war that had been established was about to turn into an open battle, and Sarah, even without wishing it, found herself at the center of the hurricane. The 48 hours following Mr. Thompson's proposal completely transformed the atmosphere of the mansion. The whispers in the corridors gave way to a cutting silence whenever Sarah passed by. The older employees who had previously treated her with disdain now showed forced respect, laden with poorly disguised resentment. Sarah decided to visit her siblings to share the news and seek advice. Upon arriving at the simple house where they grew up, she found Michael, the oldest, Nathan, the middle one, and Emma, the youngest, all anxious to understand the reason for the unexpected visit. "You won't believe what happened," Sarah began, seated in the small living room where so many memories had been built. As she recounted the events, she saw her siblings' expressions change from surprise to astonishment, and finally to concern. "Sarah, this is too serious," said Michael, running, his hand through his hair in a nervous gesture. "Are you sure it's not some kind of trap?" "Mr. Thompson has always been honest with me," Sarah defended, "but I confess I'm scared of all this." Emma, who had always been the most sensitive of the four, held her sister's hand. "What does your heart say, Sarah?" "It says I can do something." "Good with this opportunity," Sarah replied after a moment of reflection. "Not just for us, but for other families who need help." Nathan, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke up. "Knowing you, sis, you've already made your decision, haven't you?" Sarah smiled slightly. Her siblings knew her better than anyone. Back at the mansion, Sarah found an unusual commotion. Several parked cars indicated that the Thompson family was gathered. As she entered through the back door as usual, she was surprised by Eric. "Sarah, I'm glad you're back," he said, looking worried. "My siblings brought a psychiatrist to evaluate Uncle William. They're trying to declare that he's not in a condition to make decisions." Sarah's blood ran cold. "They can't do that." "They can try," Eric replied, "but knowing my uncle, this will only make the situation worse." On the upper floor, raised voices were coming from the office. Sarah discreetly climbed the stairs, stopping near the half-open door. "It's obvious that he's not in his right mind." Richard's voice sounded exalted. "What sane person would propose marriage to a maid?" "Mr. Thompson." An unfamiliar voice, presumably the psychiatrist, spoke in a professional tone. "Your nephews are concerned about your well-being." "My well-being?" Mr. Thompson's voice thundered. "Where was your concern in recent years? You only show up when you're afraid of losing your inheritance." "Uncle William," Melissa tried to intervene with false sweetness, "we're doing this for your own good." "Enough!" Mr. Thompson shouted. "Mr. Carter, please show them the results of my complete medical exams conducted last week. And as for you, doctor, I suggest you don't lend yourself to this kind of role." Sarah quickly moved away, her heart beating fast. As she turned the corner, she encountered Mrs. Harris, who was observing her with an enigmatic expression. "Miss Sarah," said the housekeeper, surprising her with the formal treatment, "Mr. Thompson left an envelope for you in your room. I suggest you read it carefully." In her room, Sarah found a thick envelope on her bed. Inside, there was a handwritten letter from Mr. Thompson and various documents. "Dear Sarah," the letter began, "I know my proposal may seem sudden, but I want you to fully understand my intentions. I've included in this envelope documents that explain my financial situation and my plans for the future. I don't want you to make your decision blindly. More importantly, I want you to know that, regardless of your answer, you have already given me back something I thought I had lost: faith in human kindness." Silent tears ran down Sarah's face as she read. The sincerity of those words touched her heart in a way she hadn't expected. That night, the mansion finally fell silent. In the garden, Elizabeth Thompson's rose bushes swayed gently in the night, breeze as if they knew that great changes were coming. Sarah, looking out the window of her room, made her decision. Tomorrow would be a new day, and she was ready to face whatever it might bring. The morning when Sarah communicated her decision to Mr. Thompson became marked in the history of the mansion. The sun had barely risen when she knocked on the office, door where he was already waiting for her, as if he knew this would be a decisive day. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice firm despite her nervousness, "I read your letter and all the documents. I accept your proposal, but I have some conditions." Mr. Thompson's face lit up with a serene smile. "I'm listening, my dear." "First, I want it to be clear that I don't want anything for myself beyond what I already have. Second, I'd like your permission to use part of the resources to create a social project, helping families who need opportunities. And third, she hesitated for a moment, I want us to talk to your family. I don't wish to be the cause of a definitive rupture between you and your nephews. Mr. Thompson observed her with admiration. Your conditions only confirm that I made the right choice. Mr. Carter will arrive in an hour to settle the legal details. The news of Sarah's acceptance spread through the mansion like wildfire. Mrs. Harris, who was passing through the corridor at the moment of the announcement, dropped the tray she was carrying, the clang of metal on the floor echoing through the house like a harbinger of changes to come. She did it, Rachel whispered to Jennifer in the kitchen. That pauper really did it. Eric, who had remained at the mansion after the events of the previous day, was the first in the family to congratulate Sarah. Take good care of my uncle, he said with sincerity in his voice, and don't let people make you doubt your worth. Mr. Carter arrived punctually, bringing a folder full of documents. During the meeting in the office, Sarah surprised everyone with her knowledge of the papers Mr. Thompson had sent her. I want it to be explicitly stated that any resources allocated to the social project cannot be contested in the future, she requested, demonstrating a shrewdness that impressed even the lawyer. Do you have any experience with contracts? Mr. Carter asked, curious. Just the experience of someone who always had to carefully read every document to protect her siblings, she replied simply. While the legal details were being settled, the mansion was buzzing with preparations for what would be a discreet but significant wedding. Mr. Thompson insisted that the ceremony take place in the garden near his late wife Elizabeth's rose bushes. She would have approved, he told Sarah. Elizabeth always said that true nobility is in character, not in surname. That afternoon, Sarah gathered all the mansion's employees in the main hall. It was time to establish a new dynamic. I don't intend to make drastic changes to the house. Routine, she announced. Each of you will continue in your functions with the same rights and duties. The only difference is that now we'll work to create a more harmonious and fair environment for everyone. Mrs. Harris, who was observing the scene with her usual serious countenance, surprised everyone by speaking up. Miss Sarah, or should I say, Mrs. Thompson, I confess that I misjudged you. Your actions demonstrate a dignity that many of us, including myself, took too long to recognize. The housekeeper's gesture, even if late, represented an important change in the atmosphere of the house. Other employees, following her example, began to show genuine respect for Sarah. However, not everything was rosy. Richard and Melissa, upon receiving the official news of the wedding, initiated a series of legal measures to try to prevent the union. They alleged everything from coercion to ulterior motives, but each attempt was methodically countered by Mr. Carter with the meticulously prepared documentation. They won't give up easily, Eric warned during a dinner at the mansion, but I didn't expect them to either. It doesn't matter, Mr. Thompson replied, holding Sarah's hand with paternal affection. Some battles are worth fighting, especially when we're on the right side of history. At night, alone in her room, which she would soon leave to occupy a new position in the house, Sarah looked out the window at the illuminated garden. Elizabeth's rose bushes seemed even more beautiful under the moonlight, as if silently blessing the events of the following day. In his office, Mr. Thompson finalized the last documents with Mr. Carter, ensuring that the future of his legacy would be in good hands. It wasn't just a wedding that would happen the next day, but the beginning of a new era for the Thompson family, an era founded not on blood ties, but on true values. The wedding day dawned with a soft spring breeze caressing the rose bushes in the garden. Sarah woke up early as usual, but this time not to perform her usual tasks. As she opened the window of her room for the last time as an employee, she took a deep breath, absorbing the scent of the roses that held so much meaning in that house. Emma and her former colleagues from the time she worked in other houses came to help her with the preparations. The chosen dress was simple but elegant, a champagne-colored model that perfectly reflected her personality. "You look beautiful, Sarah," said Emma, adjusting their mother's necklace around her sister's neck. "And most importantly, you seem at peace." Mrs. Harris knocked softly on the door. The housekeeper, who had changed so much in recent days, brought a small box in her hands. "Sarah," she began, with visible emotion, "I found this among Mrs. Elizabeth's belongings. It's a hair clip she wore at her own wedding. Mr. Thompson asked that you wear it today." The silver clip with small pearls was delicate and timeless. As she placed it in her hair, Sarah felt as if she was receiving Elizabeth's silent blessing. In the garden, the intimate ceremony was prepared. Only 40 guests, including the house's longest-serving staff, Sarah's family, Eric, and some close friends of Mr. Thompson. The rose bushes, in full bloom, formed a natural corridor to the spot where the judge was waiting. Mr. Thompson was already in his place, elegant in his navy blue suit when the soft music began to play. Sarah appeared at the beginning of the rose corridor, led by Michael. Her eyes shone with contained tears, not of sadness or fear, but of gratitude for the life that had allowed her to reach this point. "Take good care of her," said Michael as he handed over his sister, his choked voice showing the emotion of the moment. The ceremony was simple and meaningful. The judge, who knew the couple's story, emphasized in his speech the importance of the values that united them: respect, trust, and the sincere desire to do good. "The marriage we celebrate today," he said, "is proof that a person's true value lies not in their titles or possessions, but in their character and actions." When the time came for the rings, Mr. Thompson surprised everyone with his words. "Sarah," he began, his voice firm despite the emotion, "you have brought light back to this house, not just for me, but for everyone who lives here. Your generous heart and unwavering integrity have shown me that there is still hope in the world. I promise to honor our union by making your project to help other families a reality." Sarah, with tears in her eyes, responded, "Mr. Thompson, William," she corrected herself with a smile, "you've given me much more than an opportunity. You've given me trust and respect. I promise to honor that trust every day, taking care not only of you and this house, but especially of the legacy of kindness we will build together." During the small reception that followed, the mansion staff, now more relaxed, shared stories about how Sarah had transformed the house's atmosphere in recent months. "She never allowed our unfair treatment to make her bitter," commented Rachel, visibly remorseful of her previous behavior. "That taught us more than any sermon could." Eric, who was observing the scene with satisfaction, approached Sarah. "Officially welcome to the family, Sarah, although in truth you've been more family than many of us for a long time." The surprise of the party came when Mr. Carter announced that the social project idealized by Sarah was already officially registered: the Elizabeth Thompson Foundation, which would help vulnerable families with education, professional training, and job opportunities. "We chose this name," explained Mr. Thompson, "because Elizabeth always believed that true wealth lies in helping others. And now through Sarah, her desire to make a difference in people's lives will continue to live on." At the end of the afternoon, as the guests were saying goodbye, Sarah found a moment of silence near the rose bushes. The fragrance of the flowers seemed more intense than ever, as if Elizabeth was somehow present at that moment. "I'll take good care of him," Sarah whispered to the roses, "and of your memory." The Thompson mansion, which had witnessed so many changes in recent months, was now preparing for a new chapter. The evening light bathed its walls in golden hues, as if the sun itself wanted to celebrate the beginning of this new era. That night, in her new quarters, Sarah wrote in her diary, "Today is not just the beginning of a new life for me, but the start of a bigger dream, to be able to extend to other people the same opportunities that fate, in such an unexpected way, granted me. True happiness, after all, lies in being able to share our blessings with those who need them most." 6 months after the wedding, the Thompson mansion breathed a completely different atmosphere. The old environment of intrigue and tension had given way to a space of mutual respect and shared purpose. Sarah, now established in her new role, maintained the same simplicity and dedication that had always characterized her. On a sunny morning, Mr. Thompson watched from the garden as Sarah conducted a meeting with the Elizabeth Thompson Foundation team. The project had grown beyond initial expectations, already benefiting more than 50 families with education and professional training programs. "We need to expand the scholarship program," Sarah was saying to the coordinators. There are many talented young people who just need an opportunity, just like my siblings had. Nathan, her middle brother, now worked as a manager at the foundation, applying his recently completed business administration degree. Emma gave tutoring classes, while Michael coordinated the professional training program. Sarah's family had become a living example of what the project aimed to achieve. Mrs. Harris, who remained as the mansion's housekeeper, had become one of Sarah's strongest supporters. Her experience and knowledge of the local community were valuable in identifying families who needed help. "You know," she commented to Sarah during an afternoon of work, "Elizabeth would be proud. You haven't just preserved the spirit of this house but expanded it beyond its walls." The most surprising change, however, came from an unexpected direction. Richard and Melissa, after months of distance and frustrated attempts to contest the marriage, were touched by the positive impact the foundation's work was having on the community. "Sarah," Richard said during an unscheduled visit, "I came to apologize. I was wrong about you. What you're doing, it's exactly what this family needed." Melissa, although still maintaining some reservations, began to discreetly participate in some foundation events. "It's strange," she confided to Eric, "but for the first time I feel genuine pride in being part of this family." Eric, who had always supported Sarah, had finally begun to write the book about the Thompson family history. "It's a story of transformation," he explained, "about how one person can change not just a family, but an entire community through example and perseverance." Mr. Thompson, invigorated by the new energy that filled the house, spent hours in the library with Sarah, planning new projects and sharing stories. His health had improved significantly, as if the renewed purpose had given him new vigor. "You know, my dear," he said to Sarah during one of their evening meetings, "when I proposed this marriage, I thought I was just ensuring that my assets would be well managed. I didn't imagine that I was, in fact, saving the heart of this family." Elizabeth's rose bushes, now cared for with even more affection, had become a symbol of the mansion's rebirth. Sarah often found peace there, silently conversing with the woman who, even without having known her, had inspired so much of her work. On a special afternoon, the mansion hosted a different celebration, the graduation of the first class of young people from the foundation. The garden, filled with smiling families and stories of overcoming, was living proof that the true value of an inheritance lies not in material possessions, but in the positive impact we can have on the lives of others. "When I was a child," Sarah addressed the graduates, "someone told me that simple people couldn't dream big. Today, looking at each of you, I can say with certainty, there are no small or big dreams, there are dreams that transform lives, and when we help each other, these dreams become reality." Mr. Thompson, observing the scene with tears in his eyes, held Sarah's hand affectionately. "Elizabeth always said that family is who makes us be a better version of ourselves. You not only honored that thought, you multiplied it." The Thompson mansion, which had once been a symbol of power and status, now represented hope and transformation. Its doors, previously closed to the outside world, were open to all who sought an opportunity for change. And so, the story of the maid who became an heiress transformed into something much greater, a testimony to how kindness, perseverance, and genuine love can break barriers and create bridges between seemingly distant worlds. That night, as the sun set over the rose garden, Sarah contemplated the future with serenity. The path had not been easy, but each challenge faced with dignity had paved a road of transformation, not only for her, but for all those around her. "The true legacy," she wrote in her diary, "lies not in what we possess, but in the lives we touch and the changes we inspire. The family we build is not defined by blood or name, but by the love we share and the good we do together."